social, music, talk.
Yeah, in a enterprise business intelligence department, you might have 4 or 5 or 7 or 8 different people that are part of the, say, like, data assembly line, where folks are cleaning the data, integrating it, validating it to make sure that it's correct. They might make connections with these outside companies and deal with whatever security protocols are involved with making those connections. They're going to check the feeds to make sure that there's accuracy and that there's not a huge number of rows different than the day before or the year before. They're going to have some sort of benchmark. There are other folks who are going to do calculations or math against it. At Tory Burch, my first job out of Columbia, a fashion company, right? You mentioned before that other people and other businesses need this work. Mm-hmm. Yes, I shot for the moon to work in music, but I also knew that if I missed, that someone else would want me. And what happened was that one of my professors from Columbia hired me to work in a fashion company, even though I didn't know a thing about women's fashion, nor data even at that point, really, except for the fact that I really was intensely focused on learning the stuff and getting better at it. And whether it led back to music or not was an unknown question at that point.
You know, what's really interesting about music and data, how they are following a parallel path in a way ever since the 90s.
Earlier.
Earlier.
People have always interacted with the history of music using data.
Okay.
Anybody that ever went to
charts.
Anybody that ever went to a record store where there were genres in the bins.
Right.
Anybody that ever went to a classical music store as opposed to a jazz store or pop store or
it was organized based on data.
They had, quote, curators that decided which the genre or area of music they were going to specialize in. And these were ways that we were enabled to learn things, radio stations that focused on a certain genre, and you would also go to the record store and they would have posted a chart that would help you organize or understand what was happening at that moment, that, quote, snapshot of that week. Right. These are all terms in databases and business intelligence. Give me a snapshot. Show me what's happening now as opposed to the entire history.
And that's how artist career stories are built, right? On these snapshots, a series of snapshots that capture a lot of data for a short period of time.
Sure. We talk about how the Beatles had the top 5 all at once. Yeah. Every song in the top 5 was a Beatles song. You mentioned the rise or demise of genres and radio stations. That validity of that chart is based on how many stations report, right?
Right.
How many people it represents. Data is people.
Did you ever question the validity of Billboard and these and Cashbox and Record World and those kind of trade magazines, knowing the methodology?
Yes and no. I was in a area of music that was supposedly the most credible and the least corrupt of all music business, right, and most unaffected by commerciality. I often talk about how I worked one data-driven project in my whole career, Nirvana, but there were some radio stations that would not play them.
Too hard, right?
Yeah, they were considered
edgy.
They would later become part of the foundation of the AAA format.
Yeah.
But at that point, they were alternative rock radio stations, and it was, like you said, too edgy and so on.
And these are just perceptions.
But yes, the idea that one chart or format is more valid, or how I still haven't answered your question about whether or not I believed in the methodology or how. Yeah. Yes, of course. I was a Yankee fan. Billy Martin kicked dirt on umpires that he thought had made a bad decision or wanted to influence their next decision. Yes, I had a Venn diagram comparing Wilco's radio stations to Elvis Costello's. I was into the mathematics behind that chart as a way to influence what happened. And of course, each one of those radio stations had its own methodology for creating its chart too. They weren't just based on spins; they were based on some of the radio stations made a chart that was just in alphabetical order. You know, because all the
I took it
records were
seriously.
well. Let's say they're in alphabetical order because all the records are tied.
Yeah.
They all have the same number of spins that week.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course, that's how you. That's how I at least became was considered an effective promotion person. I would not have been able to do it
I'm
for
just
25 years if I wasn't good at influencing charts
So did you think
and
that
understanding the methods.
when Billboard introduced SoundScan in 1991, it radically changed the charts. Suddenly Garth Brooks had a #1 album out of nowhere, and I guess it became more accurate.
and Nirvana beat Michael Jackson's
Yeah,
Dangerous in
right.
Christmas week.
So because of that new methodology, that was good for the industry, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It woke up an industry that was falling asleep on this old system, right? That where numbers they fell into this big gray area and they influenced things in ways they shouldn't have.
Well, yes, it did, but the folks at the top of those record companies that decided which records to put money on, right?
The priorities, yeah.
But to put money on them, right? To bonus the staff, to buy advertising on the radio stations, to rent a tour bus for the band to enable them to get from town to town, but also to enable them to do morning radio shows. These were hopefully considered decisions made by people that were somewhat scientific.
And not just throwing money at bands.
Yeah, there's an old promotion guy I know of who tells a story about how he was excited to tell his boss that he had achieved a certain chart position or a certain number of ads on radio, and the guy said, "I should fire you right now," because he had put money on a record that didn't deserve it or wasn't going to come through with the audience and deliver on this spend. He had just artificially propped up something that shouldn't have been propped up.
Stack some promotions to get some ads on some for the chart to make it look like the record moved up when nothing really happened.
Right, but at the same time, there are certainly people in the industry, gatekeepers, music directors, who would respond to something that had money on it. I saw your double truck ad in Billboard. You guys are really bullish on this project. You really believe in it. Fleetwood Mac Tusk is going to be humongous. Why wouldn't you bet on Fleetwood Mac Tusk? And the difficulty if you're the record company is you've had Rumors, this monstrous album.
Right.
And
Biggest of all time in that category.
and you know that this next record doesn't have 3 or 4 hits on it. Like
Even
that.
though it's a double album.
It doesn't have the hits that Rumors has on it. We have to somehow get through to the audience, get through these gatekeepers to reach the audience and let them know the project's out. It's a real dilemma.
So, I mean, numbers really are what drive stories and records up the charts.
At Columbia, they said if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And at that moment, it became crystal clear to me why radio promotion departments and sales departments drove every record company I'd ever been in, because those were the only departments where anything measurable occurred. And those record companies were run by MBAs and lawyers with big degrees and so forth. They were smart folks, but that was all they could measure their success by.
But somewhere along the line, the story has to begin with a real story, right? A band story. It starts with what?
When we talk about the best record company people I know, we mentioned Chris Blackwell from Island Records before.
Right.
My best record company presidents, David Geffen, Johnny Barbas, Leor Cohen, and on and on. I happen to have been associated with some of the best ever. Those were the decisions that they were good at.
By looking at data and making
No, by trusting their feelings combined with data.
okay,
Each
okay.
one of them has books and interviews and so forth where they'll talk about how, no, David Geffen's the first person to say, I had no idea Nirvana was going to be as big as it was until I saw that they were -- in Greece. Then it blew my mind. Holy smokes, these guys, have really done it. You know, he didn't. I gave David Geffen's show for a cassette of Nevermind. I said, make sure David listens to this. But I had no data to back up my feeling that this was going to be an important project. I just said, make sure David knows about this one. Chris Blackwell would support projects like, I just saw the CD the other day of the soundtrack to the movie about Nelson Mandela, Son of Africa, Father of a Nation, a movie about Nelson Mandela that came out in the 90s. Chris Blackwell was very bullish on that project. He was also he also gave us some talks about the forthcoming U2 album, Pop, where it was obvious that he didn't think it was going to be as commercial probably as
Octune Baby.
as their peak albums.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So it was the data of their fandom of music that was, and the business intelligence of listening to music and knowing what to believe in and bet on and so forth.
See, that's the most important aspect of business intelligence in my world is what you're talking about, the people like Chris Blackwell having something more than a business sense to bring to the party, to have some appreciation for music, to want to take it somewhere. So tell us about your relationship with Chris Blackwell, who started Island Records.
Well, I was there for like the last 2 years of Chris Blackwell in the business as head of Island Records, and these are a couple of standout stories. He had a decentralized management style. There were 3 or 4 different presidents when I worked at Island, each in charge of different areas of the company. They talked about how there were 4 corners of the building, and each one of these 4 corner offices were kind of in competition or working for or against each other, as the case may be. But the guy's absolute genius and had the idea that, let's say, we're going to get behind the Oblivion album, for example, and it may not have been the most commercial or important project, but it added credibility and some sort of mystical quality to the other projects that we were working on to have a so-called Chris record be a priority and at the forefront of our conversations.